Hello, bonjour. Welcome to our report launch, this research partnership. And on the call with us today, we have Julie Witcover. She's actually the lead author of this report from UC Davis, myself, Colin Murphy from UC Davis, Melissa Cusack Striepe, who was formerly a student at University of Toronto, was now moved on to NRCan, Heather MacLean, a professor of engineering at the University of Toronto, as well as Lew Fulton at UC Davis. So I'm going to kind of get started. And as I see, we have a number of people in attendance. So thank you. So maybe just a bit of a background, and I'm not going to dwell on this. And I'll go to the next slide. A number of universities and organizations are involved. Just a brief kind of this work that we're presenting today is part of a comparison of what we call the local carbon fuel standard, which is of course the name given to this instrument in California, but there's different variations of this instrument in different jurisdictions. So in Canadian clean fuel regulations is what we're talking about today. But there's other working groups that we have at the JCCTRP, one on carbon pricing and policy sequencing, another on urban transit. We've had research on a transport energy nexus, and there's also a sixth working group on comparative policy. So some of that research is still in flux, some of it's been completed, and we invite you to go to the JCCTRP website for more information. So with that said, I'm going to hand off to Julie Witcover, UC Davis, who's going to really take us into this this report. Thank you. Julie,
thanks, Mark, and thanks co-panelists and especially attendees. Thanks for your interest. Yeah, what we're really going to do is we're doing a little bit deeper dive into the Canadian regulations, but also providing points of comparison with these other programs, and the paper itself goes much more into that comparison. So, but we're a little highlighting the Canadian fuel regulations here because it's the new one. Next slide, please. Here's a brief overview of what we're going to do. Basically, here's the introduction, and then we're going to talk about, what these carbon intensity standards are about, who gets involved with them. There's a credit market, which is key to the compliance. How do you get a credit under this program? And then sometimes there's confusion about a carbon intensity standard with economy-wide carbon pricing like cap and trade or carbon tax, because there's similar denominations, but we're going to go into how they are not exactly the same, and then we conclude. Next slide, please. Yeah, so carbon intensity standards have been called flexible regulations recently by in a paper with Mark Jacquard. And the idea is that because there is a market mechanism, there's some flexibility in compliance. So you don't have to dictate how anyone's going to behave in order to comply. Instead, they have to meet the standard, and how they do it is up to them, although those methods have to be certified by the regulatory authority. So in this case, it's an evolving performance standard. So there's a rating system for fuels, and then the trading market kicks in, and we'll be walking through some of that. So the credit market is really the key to the flexibility. You need enough credits to cover deficits in the program. And the focus is really actors who provide fuel to a jurisdiction. So it's not a credit market that anybody can jump into because you like low carbon fuels, unless you actually are making them or involved with them in some way. And the performance standard itself is, instead of carbon pricing that looks at kind of net emissions, this looks at emissions intensity. So emissions per unit of energy in the transportation fuel. and you're comparing it to a fossil fuel reference and to this performance standard. The key metric here that you'll hear again and again is carbon intensity, and it's measured in grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule. So it's that per megajoule that gets the volume of energy into the equation. Next slide. This is just an example that carbon intensity is not just the point of end use consumption, which is the rightmost point on this graph, but it's the entire life cycle. So it sort of reaches back into how this fuel is produced and tries to capture those emissions as well. Part of the reason is that depending on the type of fuel, different points in the life cycle are where all the emissions came in. And so if you only focused on the end use consumption, you could give incentives to a fuel that really had a bad profile further up the line that wasn't being covered by any other carbon pricing. So here's the example for liquid fossil fuels. There are similar graphics you could make for biofuels, which is a little more complicated because you also have production of the feedstock. So, and we'll get into a little bit of that too, what complications that brings in. Next slide. So here's the spotlight a little bit on the clean fuel regulations. These carbon intensity standards set a target percentage reduction relative to a base year by another year. So in Canada's case, 2016 is the base year, and their first final target is 2030, and they're looking at about a 15% reduction in the average fuel carbon intensity of their transportation fuels in that time. There's a whole menu of reductions year by year, but that's the ultimate target. The government analysis basically said that vis-a-vis a business as usual, so not vis-a-vis 2016, but business as usual, in 2030, there'd be about 18 million metric tons of carbon dioxide a year reduced. So the regulation itself went through quite a long evolution. It was announced in 2016, and initially it was really targeting all fossil fuels. So not just the transportation liquid, but all the liquid, gaseous, and solid for displacement. Okay, so we'll hear more about these other types of fuels, but originally the vision was to displace all of these fuels. And by the time that the regulation came out in draft form in December 2020, the focus had really narrowed down to liquid fossil fuels in transportation, which is much more like these other carbon intensity standards that are in place. When they didn't completely close the door on some of these other displacements because they had already broadcast that they were going to do it, so they didn't want to pull anything back. Part of the rationale for the narrowing was that in this time frame, the carbon pricing in Canada was also developing to become more stringent. And so the thought was if more carbon reductions were coming there, the clean fuel regulations wouldn't have to do as much work. The final regulations were published last July, and the regulation actually phases in, and we'll talk about a little bit in the next slide. I think it's the next slide. Yeah, so this, I'll start at the bottom of this. So this is what we were just talking about. Canada clean fuel regulations, base year is 2016. The first year of the obligation is July 2023. Right now, actually, they've already started a period where you can earn early credits and kind of hold them and then use them towards that first obligation. And there's another part of the policy that has to do with sustainability criteria and so forth that doesn't phase in until 2024. The three other programs that are really the basis of our comparison are in California, British Columbia, and Oregon. You can see they all have different names: low carbon fuel standard. British Columbia's program has a long name, and they're really shortening it to low carbon fuel standard in an upcoming ruling. And then Clean Fuels program in Oregon was the most recent. The pioneers started in 2010, and then Oregon followed in 2015. All of these programs initially targeted a 10% reduction in 10-year period. As they moved closer to that 10-year mark, they wanted to look ahead and say, hey, we're going to continue this program. It's not going to just hold at 20%, at 10%. So all have increased that next mark to 20% in 2030. But the original jurisdictions have also, California and British Columbia have said, hey, we can do more. Things are moving along. And so British Columbia has announced they're going to go for 30%, and California has signaled that they are going to tighten the 2030 target as well, although the exact amount is not clear yet. Oregon has also set a mid-2030s target for 37% reduction. Now, one thing we'll see a little bit more later is you'll notice here that the base year, the start dates of these programs are different. So even when you see the similarities in the CI reduction, you may see differences in any given year of about what the nominal target actually is. In addition, the fossil fuels and the other fuels are coming from different sources. So you're not going to have exactly the same carbon intensity for one fuel going into another, even if it used the same modeling system. But in fact, it doesn't use the same modeling system. So there are various factors here why you wouldn't expect to see exact comparability in what these targets are across jurisdictions. It's a little messy. Okay, next slide, please. And now we're going to talk about a little bit about who's covered and what the targets are. So this really is the obligated parties. It focuses on the obligated parties. Anyone who comes into the program is regulated. So, and you'll see it's mostly focused on gasoline and diesel across all the programs. And then for these other, where we have optional here, these are places where the fossil fuel in this category is not actually obligated. Okay, so you're not going to have deficits, that you're not going to have any credits that you have to get in order to cover anything. But you have the option, if you have renewable fuel generated and coming into the jurisdiction, you can generate credits against the obligations created by the gasoline and diesel. In all these jurisdictions, it's only for fuels used in the jurisdiction, not for export. And in Canada, there are various special carve-outs for remote communities because of difficulties in getting fuels and in reliance on fuels. Next slide. So this graphic gives just a feel for how this trading system is set up. Okay, so on the y-axis is carbon intensity in our grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule. We're putting gasoline at about 100. That's a rough benchmark pretty much in all of these places. And then the red line is an annual target carbon intensity that, basically the fuel pool as a whole has to meet over time, and it declines over time. So how does it meet that? The gasoline, which has a carbon intensity above that line, is gonna generate deficits in proportion to how much volume of that high carbon intensity fuel. If you have alt fuel Y way on the right, you're bringing in a fuel that has a lower carbon intensity than the standard, and it's going to earn credits. In the middle, you have this fuel that's not going to earn either credits or deficits in a given year because it actually matches what the standard is. And as I mentioned before, that annual target declines over time. So the real key here is that all fuel that comes in is going to get rated by this system, and it's going to be stacked up against that target, and it's either going to generate deficits or it's going to generate credits. Next slide. And now, focus on the Canada, that when I said that annual target declined over time, that red line, now you see that declining red line. So that is the target. And we have it here also for the other jurisdictions. And you'll notice that, as I said, the nominal CIs are a little bit all over the map. There's not a incredible congruence about that for the reasons I mentioned before. And there are two fuel pools. So the standard for gasoline and its substitutes, that's the gasoline pool, is different from the diesel pool. So if I'm coming in with a diesel substitute, I'm going to look at the diesel standard, and that's what I'm going to be rated for in terms of deficits and credits. And same is true on the gasoline side. Next slide. Okay, so who is actually involved in this credit market and policy. Next slide. So I was just talking about the gasoline and diesel pool and how the fuels themselves are measured against those pools. But really, altogether, the program just has to, if there has to be enough credits in the system to overcome the number of deficits in any given year for compliance. So while the pool matters for where you're, how much credit deficit you're creating, once those credits and deficits are created, as long as everything adds up to so that credits cover deficits, you have compliance. So you basically need to ensure that your debits by supplying carbon intensity fuels are offset and covered by enough credits. If you're a regulated party, you say, I have this many deficits, I need at least that many credits in order to comply. Now, how do you get the credits? Well, you can produce the low carbon fuels yourself, and they will generate credits. Sometimes people buy fuels like biofuels that carry credits with them, and then you can use those credits. But the credits are also separable from the fuel, and the marketplace itself has a credit price. And so you can go to the marketplace and buy credits in the credit price. And as I was mentioning before, full fungibility across the fuel pools, the fact that there's a market indicates that they're tradable, but they're also bankable for future program use, which is really important because it introduces an element of expectation. So you're not just looking at today's target, you're looking at that whole menu of targets and deciding, do I want to hold on to this credit or do I want to use it later? Next slide. Okay, so this just sort of describes these policy actors. On the one side, you've got the liquid fossil fuel producers, and they are generating market deficits, and they have to be part of this system. And the low carbon fuels, the participation is generally voluntary if you produce those fuels. I say generally voluntary because if you bring a biofuel into these jurisdictions, you are required to participate. Sorry, Colin. Got a little distracted by that. Yeah, so you're required to participate, but if you have a low carbon fuel like electricity, then you really do have the option to opt in. And so for the actors on the left, you're generating deficits. The actors on the right, you're generating credits. And importantly, you can be the same firm that goes into both categories. So we've actually seen a lot of fossil fuel producers starting to transition or including low carbon fuels, converting their refineries, for example, to biorefineries. Next slide. So this system creates a supply and demand for credits and therefore a price of credits. So and an equilibrium quantity. This picture is again complicated a little bit by this expectations that I talked about. So it's really, you know, the policy uncertainty and where things are going to go is going to affect this equilibrium point. Next slide. Yeah, Colin, you want to take over here?
Sure, thanks, Julie. All right, so now we're going to talk about the different protocols for generating credits and some of the other market considerations here. Next slide. So in conceptually, the credit generation protocols for all these different programs are very similar, but because of differences in the governance and legal structures, they often have different names. And so it gets a little bit confusing to get into the details, but at its core, they're all giving credits for activities that reduce greenhouse gas intensity on a life cycle basis. So the Canadian CFR refers to 3 compliance categories. The LCFS has 3 types of credit generation activities. LCFS has 2 categories. They also have what are known as Part 3 agreements, which are a bit of a unique opportunity where the regulator and a party can agree on a certain type of project that reduces greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation system, and they will be given credits on a sort of negotiated basis for that. So it allows some types of credit generation opportunities that are not exactly available in the other jurisdictions. This is in part because of sort of a smaller market and a different energy landscape and the need to have a little more flexibility in that program. Next slide, please. So within the jurisdictions out there, you can see that there are, we have this table both in the slide deck and in the paper, which breaks down the opportunities for supplying different types of fuels and what the credit pathway would be called in the particular terminology specific to that program. I'm not going to read this entire table to you, but generally speaking, what we see is supplying low carbon alternative fuels or switching fuels from petroleum to some lower emission alternative fuel are available as a credit generating category or credit generating activity in all three programs. And then supplying low carbon liquid fossil fuels through things like innovative crude production using solar steam, or perhaps someday EOR, though there haven't been any programs that have actually obtained credits for that yet. Those are the fuel provisions available in all programs. The low carbon liquid fossil fuels are available in the Canadian and California program, with some limited exceptions in BC and Oregon. And then low carbon supporting infrastructure at the moment is not available in Canada. California has what's known as infrastructure capacity credits, where deployment of hydrogen fueling stations or DC fast charging generate credits as if they were fully utilized, even if they're not utilized, sort of incentive to provide infrastructure in advance of vehicles coming to market. BC can accomplish this through Part 3 agreements. Those are sort of negotiated on a case-by-case basis, and Oregon has some credits for infrastructure. Next slide. So the compliance category 2 for low carbon liquid alternative fuels, this is typically what most people think about when they talk about a clean fuel standard or an LCFS. It's to incentivize the use of conventional and next generation biofuels. And one of the important features of a low carbon fuel standard, as opposed to other policy structures like a tax credit or the US's renewable fuel standard, is that the amount of incentive is very closely tied to the emissions reductions the fuel generates on a life cycle basis. So you have first generation fuels like corn ethanol or soybean oil based biodiesel or renewable diesel do get incentive under all these programs at this point, but is significantly less incentive than a more advanced cellulosic or low carbon or fuel made with a CCS associated with it. So at present, all low carbon liquid fuels supplied to the Canadian market would be able to generate credits. Though with the nature of an LCFS, as the target goes down, eventually, if some fuels can't continually to reduce their carbon intensity, the target might eclipse them. That is, that the fuel might start out in a program generating credits, but eventually not be able to keep up with the pace of target acceleration, and eventually might switch to becoming a deficit generator at some point. This typically doesn't happen until you start getting to targets in the 20 to 30% range at the earliest. So it's not something we have seen yet in any of the programs, but it is sort of an intended characteristic of the low carbon fuel standard model. And then in all programs, the intent is that every alternative fuel that's brought in is going to have a life cycle assessment done that will get at the life cycle carbon intensity specific to that fuel. But all programs have default values that can be used for fuels, either when they first enter the market as some of the data needed to inform the LCA is being collected, or if a fuel is coming in through spot trades or in very small volumes and it's not worth it, they can use this default value. These tend to be very conservative values, so you don't get a lot of credit. There's a very strong incentive for producers to rapidly conduct their LCA and shift to their own unique value, but the default values do give the opportunity for sort of relatively easy and rapid entry into the market where appropriate. Next slide, please. And so the low carbon liquid fuel supply, generally speaking, the credits are generated at the point of production. So a fuel producer, when they contract the fuel for sale in the California market, they register with a regulator, the credits are generated there, and the credits are then given to the point of producer. Sometimes that can be done at the point of importing if a fuel importer is buying from sort of a commodity or merchant producer and importing from there. The credits themselves can either remain attached to the fuel and transmit as they move through the supply chain, or they can be separated and sold or transferred individually, and then the fuel transferred without the credit attached in ways that are fairly similar to other environmental instruments. Next slide, please. So one of as Julie mentioned earlier, there's differences in life cycle analysis across jurisdictions, depending on the sort of analytical and research capacity of the local fuel and research community. Different models might be chosen. Particularly in the area of indirect land use change, there are a lot of models that are attempting to quantify the impact of indirect land use change from biofuel production. All those models are have their own challenges. I would say none of them are right. It's an exceedingly complex area to model, and the academic and research space has just really not quite solved that problem yet. So in Canada, there's a model that was developed by ECCC, which ended up really being reflected primarily as a set of kind of life cycle inventory, so input data and a set of methodology that in theory could be applied to any of the commercial LCA software packages or analytical tools that are out there. And in Canada right now, there is no indirect land use change protection, but some inclusion of land use and biodiversity criteria. And this ended up being an area of some controversy, particularly with the first generation fuels. The indirect land use change effects are quite significant, and there's some real concern whether the land use and biodiversity criteria are going to be sufficiently protective. California and Oregon use models or use versions of the GREET model along with the OPG model. GREET is the life cycle analysis model. OPG estimates the emissions from petroleum production, so it helps set the fossil fuel baseline. The real difference between the California and the GREET model is largely just that the models are changed to reflect the different transportation distances to get to one market or the other. But other than that, they're built on the same sort of platform, which is the GREET model, which is developed by the Argonne National Lab and has a lot of history and development behind it. Both of them use the GTAP bio and AEZ models for land use change, except in the case of corn, where they have switched to the C Club model. In British Columbia, they use the GH Genius LCA model, and they also omit indirect land use change from their policy as well. So I think there is a lot of very well justified concern in the research community that omitting land use change is going to lead to significant underestimates of emissions, which will lead to the program sort of being able to nominally claim more greenhouse gas reductions than they actually deliver. Next slide, please. So compliance category 3 in the Canadian program is replacement of petroleum with low carbon non-liquid alternative energy sources. And so the main one that is in small use now, but is going to become the primary energy supply for transportation, particularly light duty transportation, is electricity. And so these programs all recognize the value of electricity as an emissions reducing technique. They also reflect the fact that electric powertrains are substantially more efficient at converting stored energy to motion than internal combustion engines. And so there's what's called an energy efficiency ratio, which is used to correct for that difference in efficiency, and that's what helps really drive the very strong treatment of electric vehicles under low carbon fuel standards. Additionally, the programs accept and provide credits for things like hydrogen, both fossil and renewable natural gas, propane and renewable propane, et cetera, sort of anything that can provide transportation energy, as long as you can do a life cycle analysis and quantify the value of it. Conceptually, it could be a credit generating opportunity under a low carbon fuel standard or the clean fuel regulation. Next slide, please. So with electric vehicles, there is two sort of real ways that charging happens, and they kind of by necessity have to be treated differently for the purpose of regulation and assigning credits. For EVs, the vast majority of them that have been deployed so far are light duty electric vehicles in private ownership. And so most of those are charged, about 8% of those are charged at the home of the vehicle owner or leasee. In that case, most programs allocate the credits to the distribution entity, so usually the local utility. And there's often a real careful restrictions on how that utility can spend the credit. So in California and Oregon, they're basically required to spend revenue from credits generated from residential EV charging in ways that support the continued expansion of the electric vehicle market. So that can include rebates on electric vehicles themselves, or investments in infrastructure, or investments in chargers, either at households or public or multi-unit dwelling chargers. Next slide, please. For non-residential electric vehicles, this is things like public charging, or where you have EV fleets and commercial use, then it's usually at the point of charging that the credit is generated. So really, whoever owns and operates the charger generates the credits. So in this case, it's there's a sort of set metering at the charger, and then the charger owner or operator generates them. In many cases, you'll have electric charging service providers, companies like EVgo or NRG or US Electrify America, who may contract with a site host to install and maintain the chargers. And then the credits can be part of the revenue stream that supports the provision of the charging service. So the credits could go to the charging service provider, or they could go to the site host, or they could be divided in some way. So there's a number of contractual structures, but all of them rest on the same basic principle that for non-residential charging, the credit occurs at the charger, which is essentially where the electricity comes off the grid and goes from being a generic unit of energy that can go to anything and becomes a transportation fuel at that point. Next slide, please. And so compliance category 1 is low carbon liquid fossil fuels. So this is credits generated in ways that reduce the carbon intensity of fossil fuels. And so these are available in Canada to Canadian producers with mechanisms for projects outside of Canada, but it's really sort of focused on domestic production. There's a number of types of projects that are envisioned here, including the use of carbon capture and storage, including enhanced oil recovery, or the switch to low carbon intensity electricity, or energy for steam flooding if that's required, or finally the co-processing of biomass or other renewable feedstocks along with fossil fuels. And so these are known in California, these are known as project-based credits. They essentially generate a stream of credits to the refinery owner. Typically speaking, clean fuel standards and LCFS programs don't try to keep fossil fuel as a static baseline that's relatively flat across the jurisdiction, and any activity to reduce the carbon intensity of fossil fuels is treated as an additional credit stream. Conceptually, you could have multiple carbon intensities and multiple sort of varieties of fossil fuel coming in. It's generally viewed that that's a more complex way to do it. So typically speaking, if a producer engages in this, they will generate credits representing the additional reductions below the baseline they would get. In California, there have been a number of projects to use solar energy, both to displace electricity needed in drilling and pumping, and in some cases to use concentrated solar to generate steam to displace natural gas used for steam flooding of mature or declining wells. As I mentioned earlier, carbon capture and sequestration, there are protocols in the California program, as well as in the Canadian program. At this point, none of those have been used. There have been no pathways approved in California. And so we're sort of waiting for that activity to come in. But this is really, at least in the California context and in the Canadian context as well, the fuel space is envisioned as where CCS and EOR will sort of enter into the climate policy portfolio. Next slide, please. And so obviously for the low carbon liquid fossil fuel supply, the credits are generated at the point of production, and the credits are given to the firm producing fuel. And again, the credits are sort of separated from the actual crude oil and just become the separate stream of project-based credits. Next slide, please. So we wanted to sort of conclude with a discussion of comparison with carbon pricing and a discussion of market activity, particularly in California, which is the biggest and most mature LCFS market that we can use as an example of what Canada might want to expect. Next slide, please. So in California, credit prices on their LCFS started quite low. They ended up staying relatively low for a number of years, in part because there was a legal challenge that took several years to resolve that sort of suppressed market activity, as well as some political uncertainty regarding the expiration of California's climate authority. Once that was resolved, prices rather quickly climbed to about $200 per ton. But since then, in about 2021, we saw a really noticeable drop in LCFS credit prices. They're down to about $70 a ton right now. And this is really due to three factors that we've identified. One is the effect of COVID, which obviously reduced demand for transportation fuels, particularly for gasoline, more so than diesel. And gasoline is the main deficit generating fuel in the LCFS program. So you saw just this big unexpected transient drop in deficit creation, and that obviously tipped the balance of the market more towards supply. The second reason is we feel like they're just the long-term fundamentals based on the 20% target that CARB had adopted previously indicated the market was going to be oversupplied. So the rapid deployment of electric vehicles, the rapid growth in the availability of renewable diesel in California, just the fundamentals said the market was going to be a little long on credits. And finally, there were some interactions between the LCFS and the federal renewable fuel standard in the US that contributed to the price decline. As a result of this price decline, the Air Resources Board in California is very aware of this and has indicated, a very clear intent to raise the 2030 target during a rulemaking that has long been scheduled for next year. And we anticipate that target raise will help support the market. And so, assuming that happens and assuming all else equal, we expect to see some recovery in the LCFS credit price relatively shortly. Next slide, please. So one of the areas that often pops up is there's a lot of confusion between a cap and trade system and an LCFS. This is in part because both of them use as a core instrument a credit, which is nominally, denominated in dollars per ton. The issue is a cap and trade credit or an emissions allowance, like in the EU ETS, is a very different thing than an LCFS credit. Even though they're both measured in dollars per ton, it's a very apples to oranges comparison, and so they're not fungible. They cannot and should not be exchanged across markets. But there are some similarities in the fact that they establish a market and establish a sort of price for additional marginal emissions reductions. So they're similar in that they're both measured in tons of carbon and denominated in dollars, and they both provide a monetary value. They also create this relationship between, the more reductions you get in a covered program, the more incentive you create, and so that provides incentive to deploy low carbon technology. And they also allow the trading of compliance credits. And so what that means is entities that have options for rapid near-term reduction can generate more credits than they need to cover their own obligations and sell the rest on the market and find sort of, profit opportunities that way. Whereas entities that do not have the technology yet or do not have the opportunity or the capital to make similar investments, they can comply for a time using purchase credits, though the sort of increasing price and decreasing supply of credits in both cases means that eventually they're going to have to comply as well. How they're different is that most emissions trading schemes are designed to cover the entire economy, not just the transportation fuel sector. And in fact, when you look at things like the California cap and trade or the EU ETS, we see that different sectors respond at different carbon prices. And so at the relatively low prices that we see in California and in Europe, you see a lot of response in electricity and industrial energy efficiency markets, but transportation typically doesn't respond to carbon pricing until it gets rather high. So the LCFS lets you really focus on transportation and have a higher carbon price within that sector without shocking the rest of the economy. Very critically, a cap and trade credit or an ETS credit measures the absolute amount of reductions. A credit means it is a ton of carbon, whereas an LCFS credit is a relative ton. It is a ton relative to that year's standard. So a particular fuel will sort of require the same number of cap and trade credits every year in order to offset its emissions, whereas the amount of credit or deficit a given fuel generates under an LCFS changes every year as the target changes. So because it gets sort of more difficult to generate credits as the target gets lower and lower, the sort of amount of effort it takes to generate a credit is different, and that sort of leads to why you typically see higher prices in an LCFS market than you do in a cap and trade market. LCFS programs are revenue neutral to the state. Really, an LCFS is just a transfer of revenue from high carbon fuels to low carbon fuels. Whereas in a cap and trade, everything, the revenue goes to the regulatory entity or to the government, and then it is allocated in whatever way that particular entity or government decides to do. So you typically also see sort of higher prices on that. The cap and trade will create kind of a competitive advantage for lower carbon fuels because they get charged less. Whereas an LCFS, there is a requirement for low carbon fuels to actually enter the market. And so there's a stronger incentive for the incumbent fuel producers to make sure enough low carbon fuels enter the market that they can find credits. And also there's sort of a stronger push against higher carbon fuels that comes out of the LCFS than you do out of a cap and trade. Next slide, please. And so this slide is trying to get into some examples of price effects and show how things are different. And so what you see is these are examples of the price impact to the consumer for diesel and for renewable diesel under a $20 cap and trade and LCFS price or a $200 cap and trade and LCFS price. It shows you some of the energy density and carbon intensity assumptions that we put in, as well as the production costs. So under a cap and trade, the fuels go from having $1 a gallon difference in price to having about a little less than 80 cents, but the cost of both fuels goes up. Whereas under an LCFS, under the $20 credit price, the diesel goes up, but it goes up significantly less per gallon at a relatively low 10% carbon intensity target. But the renewable diesel actually becomes cheaper. And so the gap narrows the same amount, but it has a lower net impact on aggregate fuel expenditures to consumers, because rather than having the money leave and go into whatever sort of the cap and trade chooses to spend its revenue on, it stays within the fuel market. As your carbon price gets higher, or as your target gets higher, this behavior exacerbates or sort of becomes more intense. And so under a $200 a ton carbon price, what you see is now the renewable diesel, the lower carbon fuel, is actually significantly cheaper than the petroleum diesel, even though its fundamental production costs have not changed. So that higher that higher LCFS target has flipped the economics and not just given the lower carbon fuel a competitive advantage, but actually made it outcompete and given it lower fundamental costs without having to just massively drive up the aggregate cost to fuel consumers everywhere. So there are absolutely advantages for both. I'm not trying to turn this into a my carbon policy is better than your carbon policy sort of situation, but they function in very different ways. And the effect is reflected in how you have in the final price to consumers. And so because of this behavior, we feel like the LCFS provides a very strong complement to a carbon price and allows for a clear focus on bringing in the lowest carbon fuels. Next slide, please. Julie, did you want to take back over for the conclusions, or Mark, was this going to be you?
I can.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So next slide, please. Yeah, so our main takeaways with this paper and this presentation is that there are distinct technical differences between these programs, this new Canadian one and the other North American carbon intensity standards that were already in place. But there are similarities in the general stringency and level of ambition at the beginning, and also the general principles. We're looking at carbon intensity. There's sort of different ways of reaching that metric, but really a lot of similarities, and then details in the, differences in the details that make them not directly comparable. So similarly, you've got different types of similar carbon intensity reduction pathways in terms of the step-by-step, year-by-year, what we're trying to get. Canada is really aiming to get closer in 2030 to where the other jurisdictions are. it's only 7 years to meet it, but remember the base year was back in 2015, so that's over a 15-year period. So there may be significant changes in the Canadian fuels situation right now that just generates credits relative to 2015 without anyone having to take additional steps. So that's part of what's going on now with these early credits that people can just have recognized. There are really significant differences in what kinds of activities can generate credits, or not a lot, but they're there. That's not always the same activities will generate credits everywhere. There are different life cycle analysis models. And that's true even for Canada and Oregon, but especially when you look at the US-Canadian divide, there are different models in play, different components in that life cycle analysis. Notably, the indirect land use change is in the North American jurisdictions, but not in Canada. And then we didn't really talk about it here, but in the paper, we talk about different compliance. We talked about compliance mechanisms here, but there are also other types of price control mechanisms that differ in the different jurisdictions. Our main takeaway was that the conjunct of these programs working together is likely to encourage low carbon fuel market to grow. But there are technical differences. I mean, the question you always get is, will this become one single market? And that is difficult given these technical difficulties and the way certain parts of the program are really tailored to the jurisdiction's needs and the jurisdiction's desires. So our other takeaway is that basically the leads of these jurisdictions work very closely together to try to make sure that that they're aligned, the programs are aligned to the extent possible, and do share those common bedrock of principles of how you're measuring carbon intensity and how you're crediting and how you're getting deficits. But too much inconsistency could really create a less tenable patchwork for the regulated party and could deter market growth. So that eye on harmonization, if not unification, continues to be important. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. This is Mark Purdon again. I think maybe it would be appropriate to just note we have Melissa Cusack Striepe and Professor Heather MacLean have joined us now. I don't know, maybe I would pass the floor to them, the virtual floor, and then we can open up for some Q&A. I know there's been a few questions been asked. If you do have a question, please, you can type it in the Q&A button up on the Zoom chat, and we'll try and answer them in due time. I don't know, but Heather or Melissa, if you have any contributions.
No, I just want to say great presentation. Great work, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. Heather MacLean here. I don't have anything to add, but pleased to participate in the discussion and questions session.
Okay, well, maybe I'll just relate to the panelists. We've had a few questions, and maybe the first, any insights on the ECCC model differences from GREET and why Canada chose this platform? Maybe
I could take a stab at it. I mean, I know less about the differences from GREET because the ECCC model is so new, and I don't know that there's a definitive comparison for equivalent pathways. But I think part of the reason Canada chose the platform was one of the reasons aligns with why British Columbia chose another platform, is that they felt that the pathways in Canada were sufficiently different and not covered in the GREET model, and would require so much more development in GREET that it was really worth doing a standalone product that was really tailored toward the Canadian situation. And this platform in particular, as opposed to GH Genius, I think there were a need to have it have the model be publicly available and not have proprietary concerns and things like that. So my understanding is that's why they developed their standalone product, which is really kind of more of a database that can fit into a lot of life cycle analysis models, softwares that are out there. So it's meant to be more of a plug and play system. But really interesting question about the model differences from GREET, and hoping we and others can dig into what that will mean for the bottom line if you have a low carbon fuel, and whether you want to send it to Canada or the US jurisdictions just based on the modeling differences.
Any other reactions? Heather, Colin?
Yeah, go ahead, Heather.
I was just going to say that I agree with the reasons that Julie has given. I think that the Canadian government wanted a slightly more broad-based model. They're operating it within open LCA, and they are developing sort of representative pathways with sort of higher resolution on the details, but they're also using it more broadly as a tool beyond the clean fuel regulations, and going to be using that more broadly within the government. So I think that they thought about using the GH Genius model, and while there were many years of development of that, and it had a lot of great assets and pathways within it, but I think that they, as Julie has mentioned, they wanted something that had perhaps a broader base of development and more accessibility, and something that would be then maintained sort of within the government. So
The one thing I'd add is, at least conceptually, you should be able to put in the same sort of assumptions and data into any LCA model and come out with the same answer, or a very equivalent answer. In practice, it's not always that easy, but there's a lot of smart people out there working on this. I think that can happen. The key thing for sort of interoperability and easy understanding and harmonization of standards is that everybody's using the same principles for making analytical assumptions that underpin every LCA. Things like system boundary definition, co-product allocation decisions, choosing which data source to use for life cycle inventories, stuff like that. So that's something that can absolutely happen, even if everybody's using a different software package.
Great. I'm going to proceed with another question. We have a number here, so buckle your safety belts. Going to move to a question by Maya Yegin. Who is carrying out LCA, the regulator, the regulated party, or the regulated party? If it is the regulated party, what are the control mechanisms being used by the regulator? So
I can at least answer in California, where we spend a lot of time developing these provisions and have a model that's pretty well established at this point. The party, so basically whoever's owning or developing the credit generating project, conducts the LCA using the protocols required by the regulator. They do sort of the first pass at running it through GREET to arrive at an answer. The regulator then reviews the work to ensure that they followed all the rules, essentially, and that they are appropriately providing data, and that the work they did is sort of up to snuff. And then in California, after the pathway is approved, in the future there are verification periods, and there's now a sort of third-party verification program where you have independent, kind of consultants and auditors go through and ensure that the project is being operated so the real world data for production matches what was modeled and was on the paperwork to the regulator. So the primary work is done by either the developer or most commonly the consultant they hire to do the LCA, but the regulator has an extensive ability to evaluate and review and ensure that the quality of the work meets their standards, and then there are opportunities to verify later.
Yeah, I think Canada is really mimicking that system. And just to say, the model has kind of emission factors built in with certain inputs. So the key is really the inputs. And then if you, for some reason, think that you have different emission factors, then, in California, and I mean, there are other ways to work around that, but it's just more complicated in terms of the verification process. So, yeah, so you really rely on the verification of the data, and then on the model emission factors to create the result. And the default, I should say, the defaults are set up to be conservative so that you're not going to have people choosing to be the default and in order to get credits for something that they're not doing. And it also adds the incentive to the regulated party to go ahead and do your own life cycle analysis to get more credits if you're doing something better than this conservative kind of higher carbon intensity default.
Okay, so there's anything else to add or not? I'll proceed maybe to the next question. Charles, again, to what extent can the life cycle emissions differ from UNFCCC reporting standards from a national point of view in the case of imported fuels?
So I guess I'm not terribly deep on like the details of how UNFCCC requires their emissions calculations to be done. In general, most national reporting really only focuses on sort of tailpipe emissions within that jurisdiction's boundaries. And so what this does is it creates this implicit loophole to offshore or outsource emission causing activity, right? If it's happening outside your jurisdiction, especially in the case of biofuels, if the jurisdiction's making an assumption of biogenic carbon being carbon neutral, it creates this real treatment that makes alternative fuels look better than they really are under those standards. So I would have to get into the details, but my very superficial understanding is that most of the accounting and emissions inventory standards that are aligned with UNFCCC type of activity are more focused on emissions. I can't remember what the UNFCCC's recommended treatment on biogenic carbon is. I think their principle is carbon neutrality, but recognize there are emissions that go into creating the biomass. So the carbon itself, the embodied carbon is carbon neutral, but that you should not ignore the life cycle emissions. Just most regulatory programs that don't have an explicit life cycle basis end up functionally ignoring the life cycle emissions. And so that's why having an explicit life cycle standard like this is really important.
I would just add, I think there is a literature on the contrast between the UNFCCC approach, which is a production-based emissions accounting approach, and sort of the life cycle analysis, which is more of a consumption-based approach. And there's a literature on this that suggests that depending on how your accounting proceeds, there's quite different responsibility is quite different depending on the type of accounting that you use. So there's maybe stuff to unpack here, because we're now combining those. We have a consumption-based regulatory tool that is considering the global emissions impact of consumption of fuels in Canada. So it could be something that could be worth exploring. I'm going to go to another question from David Baudouin. Can you explain again the different levels of obligation towards which each credit category can be used, 1, 2, and 3?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I mean, the obligation is created by using the fossil fuel, and you can use any kind of credit generating operation in order to counteract those deficits. So credit category 1, you're only going to be generating it's basically where, in what sector is the credit going to be generated. So that's going to be in the fossil fuel sector. In category 2, it's kind of biofuels, things that can go into internal combustion engines or engine vehicles and are kind of drop in or blended. And then 3, that requires another kind of vehicle to be used. But once you've generated the credit in that category, it can be sold and cover the obligation to any degree. It might be true that category 1 has some kind of limit towards own obligation. It did in the draft rule, and I'm not remembering, so that's something I can get back to you on, that you might not be able to cover your entire obligation through credit category 1 if you are a fossil fuel producer. I believe that's true. I have 10% in my head, but I'm not, or maybe 10% per quantification method.
In California, it's 10%. You can't get more than 10% of your obligation through the project-based credits from things like refinery investments or innovative crude. So that might be where your 10% is coming from. I also don't recall whether Canada followed California's example there.
Yeah, they did have something like that in the draft rule, but I don't remember in the final rule. And also, I think it was per method that you're using and not in total. So if you sort of stack those quantification methods like EOR and CCS, you might be able to get to a higher amount, but I'm not 100% sure. So that's a good question for another deep dive.
Yeah, and one of the things I would say is the LCFS is explicitly intended to give obligated parties flexibility in figuring out how they're going to meet the target. And that flexibility has been really useful. If you go back to the initial modeling from California's LCFS done in 2008 or 9 when they were first planning the system, the projections were that cellulosic ethanol was going to become one of the most important compliance fuels in the program by the late teens and early 2020s. As it turns out, cellulosic ethanol never took off, never overcame its technical challenges. But electric vehicles and diesel substitutes, particularly renewable diesel, ended up growing much faster than anticipated and providing a lot more credit than the modelers back in 2008 ever foresaw. So that flexibility ends up being really important, especially in a program that is explicitly intended to push new technology into the market, right? You can't be certain the new technology is going to be able to meet the challenges until it actually gets out there and demonstrates that, and we can't just sort of sit around and wait for the technology to demonstrate itself, when there's a climate challenge out there. So yeah, there's certainly the opportunity where you could have one of these pathways end up generating much more credit, and I think the early modeling shows. I think the guardrails around credits from reduced emissions from fossil fuels are to ensure that you can't have compliance by just sort of reducing the emissions of fossil fuels incrementally, because really there's no pathway to get to the extremely deep, carbon intensity reductions that are required by just incrementally improving fossil fuels. At some point, you have to get off fossil fuels entirely. So it's seeking to find that balance between, minimizing the emissions from fuels that we know are going to be part of the fuel portfolio for at least a couple decades, but not letting that become sort of an off-ramp or a dead end that prevents the deployment of technologies that can actually get you to zero.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to, there's an anonymous question. Thank you. It's in French, and so I'm going to translate. Just I think it's trying to, the example of the combination of the LCFS and cap and trade, that they would, if implemented together, as would be the case in California, perhaps not maybe in Quebec as well, maybe not elsewhere in Canada, because cap and trade is only in Quebec and California right now. But they would be expected to have a cumulative effect. And maybe if you may have a reaction to that, if that is indeed the case.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So the main effect of having them both is they tend to kind of synergistically reinforce themselves. So if you were somebody who had either a large diesel fleet and you were buying diesel commercially, or you were a producer or distributor of diesel, if you displace that with renewable diesel, not only would you be getting sort of the price effects of the low carbon fuel standard or the clean fuel regulation, but you would also be reducing the amount of petroleum diesel, and so therefore the amount of cap and trade credits you have to buy to offset to cover the emissions, the embodied carbon in that diesel fuel. So you get sort of the LCFS price incentive for low carbon diesel, plus the avoidance of the cap and trade obligation, the higher cap and trade obligation that would go on petroleum diesel. So what this means, and there was a report done about 5 years ago in California that sort of went through and modeled it out. The numbers are all very out of date, but conceptually it's good, and I'll try to find a link to that and drop it into the chat momentarily. It basically showed that because you have the LCFS significantly reducing the amount of petroleum consumption in California, it takes a lot of pressure off the cap and trade market by reducing the amount of credits needed to cover the embodied carbon petroleum fuels, and leads to a lower cap and trade credit price. Now in California, that may be kind of a mixed bag, because the California cap and trade price has been riding the price floor for basically up until the last year, and now it's sort of one small step off its price floor. And there's certainly arguments to be made that a slightly higher carbon price might have been good for climate policy. But in general, you see the effect of the LCFS is to reduce the amount of obligations needed under the cap and trade market. So it tends to sort of reduce the sum impact of the two programs is less than the price impact of either program individually summed together.
And I would just add that in the case of renewable diesel, like Colin was saying, if you're displacing petroleum diesel with renewable diesel, then you're not earning those deficits. But what's more, the cap and trade looks at that carbon in the renewable diesel and says there's no charge on it. So you're basically getting that for free in the cap and trade. And while the carbon is being accounted for in the LCFS, it's being, it's an incentive and not a charge, because of this difference between looking at absolute carbon emissions in a cap and trade and looking at them relative to something, to some standard in the LCFS.
If I may, I would just add that we actually published a paper that touches on this topic last year in a review of policy research, which looked at the relationship between cap and trade, the LCFS, and also there's a ZEV mandate in California, now replicated in Quebec. There's some other interesting policies at the metropolitan level, urban level in California, and just sort of unpacking the relationship between those instruments and the cap and trade, and this kind of synergistic or yin and yang effect between the regulatory complementary policies and the carbon pricing is something that I think is quite interesting and might be something that some of you might be interested in reading on. And maybe I would just expand on this in the same direction to our panelists. What about the relationship between the clean fuel regulations and a carbon tax? Would that be cumulative as well?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing. I guess the little nuance there is in British Columbia. I don't think the biofuel is outside the tax, so you don't have that extra little push for the biofuels that you do in California. And there'd be less, because as a tax, you're not going to have this downward price effect that you have with the LCFS. If you have a higher LCFS credit price, it's doing more of the work and lowering the cap and trade price. But if you have a carbon tax that's fixed, it's not going to move. So you're not going to have that interaction. But it still would be cumulative, the impacts at the consumer side.
The other thing I'd say is in any jurisdiction where the most typical blend of fuels that consumers buy is a biofuel blend, and that's the case anywhere where you've got E10 or kind of low biodiesel blends, there's an effect within the LCFS where within every gallon you have 90% petroleum and 10% ethanol. The petroleum is essentially being charged under the LCFS. The ethanol is receiving credit under the LCFS. So there is a bit of at least a conceptual kind of canceling out effect that happens within every gallon. Now, it's not sufficient to the point where you would fully cancel out. There's still some of the charge on the petroleum is going to support electricity or renewable diesel or other fuels, but you do tend to see a smaller net price signal to gasoline consumers than the aggregate price signal that the producers see, right? The producers sort of feel more price impact than consumers. And there's debates within the economic space about whether this is a good or bad thing. You know, the really kind of classical Chicago school economists say, no, consumers should see the full price impact of everything they do. I'm more of the opinion, I think this is where at least the policy community in California is that the risk of regressive effects, sort of pricing lower income people out of being able to drive are such that we would rather see lower price impacts on consumers in a way that would kind of protect them. You don't want to just pass the full price signal. And so the behavior of having a stronger price signal to fuel producers than to fuel consumers is actually a feature.
And this is a really active area of research, this pass through. So in other words, if you have the the policy cost or benefit coming at the producer, where does it fall along the supply chain? You have places where you'd expect it to, but does that really happen empirically? And we're only now having enough of a track record to try to tease that out. It's not an easy question. So on the cost side, most petroleum costs do get passed along retail. On the biofuel side, kind of the nature of the market is still evolving a little bit. So the competitiveness of that market is really key to at least conceptually thinking how much of that would end up benefiting the consumer and how much might go somewhere else to help cover the cost, for example, that extra cost.
Great. I think that actually this discussion in response to the second question by Charles again, talking about this, how the cap and trade and clean fuel standards may exist simultaneously and their interactions. I might then pass to another question by Jonathan Rubin. How do EV credits to distributors impact their rate base for rate of return calculations?
So a lot of the, unlike credits that go to biofuels, in the EV space, there are more prescriptions done on what you can do with the credit revenue. And it's actually an area where the jurisdictions use to try to target revenue use towards greater EV adoption and sometimes disadvantaged communities. So it's sort of the utilities are a little more constrained in terms of actually using that credit value to lower the cost to electricity that the consumers are using, which is sort of the paradigm that you expect for the other fuels. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the that's what occurred to me with that one.
Okay, and then I'll move to
Mark, one quick thing. So we were having trouble with the chat and getting the link to come through in the chat. So I actually put it in the answer to Charles in the Q&A. So I think all participants, if you wanted to find that report on the cap and trade LCFS interactions, it's in the answer to Charles' question.
Great. There's still another question, again, from Jonathan Rubin. In the presentation of California system, the presentation by Colin stated that the LCFS kept the funds in the transportation sector. How do the electricity fuel credits generated at the home differentiate between electric cars versus, for example, heat pumps?
So historically, most of that's been done using an estimation methodology where California has relatively good numbers or good data on the number of EVs registered within each utility's territory. They have some data by doing sort of samples of EV driving to get an estimate of the number of miles per year each of those EVs is driven, and then using kind of basic math to convert that to the number of kilowatt hours for each utility. And they do it by estimation. In places where somebody has installed a charger that can separately meter, there are opportunities to let that company come in and sort of generate the credits and disperse them following the same rules that the utilities would. There is a lot of CARB clearly understands that an estimation methodology like that is not ideal, and so there's been a lot of interest in switching to something more accurate. There's been a bit of wrangling between the utilities and the OEMs, the auto OEMs about who should do that, because whoever measures it sort of ends up getting first dibs at the credits, again within the limits of used to support broad deployment of EVs, but there's certainly a lot of interest by all groups in being the ones to get their hands on the money first and let their priorities be reflected. Moving forward, given the really sophisticated onboard telematics with every EV, there's really no reason why you have to have the household meter be the one that actually monitors the charging. The EVs could measure that, and so now it's alternatively, you could either have a meter on the charger if you're using something more sophisticated than just plugging your EV into like a dryer plug in the garage. There's a number of people who've also said that you can, just by looking at the load profiles, be able to sense when an EV is going on and off, because they tend to be relatively strong loads. So there's a lot of technological solutions, and in California at least, it's come down to who can make the best case about data security in order to protect the privacy of the EV owners, and who can sort of make the best case about the accuracy and the ability to provide useful data to the regulator. But yeah, right now it's either estimated, or in the case where there's a charger that actually directly meters, they use that data to help sort of inform their estimation methodology.
And yeah, and I'd add that, I mean, right now, they basically use the meter data within a utility area to estimate for everyone else. So to the extent that, that's not a representative sample, it's not it's not going to be an accurate reflection. And it's also that system is going away. So CARB has opened the floor for this technical discussion officially. And it's really a good one, because a lot of revenue is being generated in this way. And as you say, I think in Canada, you need to have it metered in order to get the credit. So that they because they came in later, they were able to do something different there. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think that responds to all the questions that are out there. If there's any more, go ahead. We have another 10 minutes that we have left. If I don't know if there's any maybe final thoughts from our panelists. Yeah, I'll just say I'm not sure if I was able to post the link to the report. If you did find it, if you can't find it on the website of the chair and decarbonization, just send us an email. You have our email address there, decarbonization with an S at uqam.ca. And there's one question by will the recording of the presentation be available? Yes. We will be, we have recorded this and we will be putting it on YouTube perhaps hopefully by next week, along with the PowerPoint and as well as the report.
Yeah, I guess my only final thought is that there's been more interest in this policy in other jurisdictions. Washington State is getting ready to launch its version of this in January 2023. There are other US states that have examined it in some form and are having internal debates about it, like Minnesota, Colorado, New Mexico, New York. So I think having comparisons like this in terms of kind of a menu of how this is being done, while it's a very in the weeds technical type of thing, I think it has some usefulness to sort of track how malleable is this policy to different jurisdictional needs, and then what is the bedrock of commonality that you need in order to have it kind of add up to a signal for more low carbon fuels in the marketplace.
Yeah, I would say, coming into the space as a researcher and someone who's been kind of associated with the LCFS for a while, we're happy to see the amount of interest in low carbon fuels, and we think that standards like the LCFS, or carbon intensity based, life cycle based fuel performance standards are absolutely critical parts of the decarbonization portfolio if you're going to get emissions down to critical levels and meet targets, important targets in time. There is, I think, a recognition among a lot of climate policy experts and also those in the sort of climate policy funding community that the LCFS is the gold standard for, the clean fuel regulation is the gold standard for achieving these outcomes, and we agree with that. The danger that I'm starting to see is, I think a number of funders sort of say, well, once you've got the LCFS in place, that's it, right? We're done, work finished, we can go turn our attention elsewhere. And what we're seeing in California is the LCFS is a structure, it's a framework for achieving goals, but there's a constant need for small course corrections and for adjustments and changes to it. We have to, the target level has to be changed in order to reflect the deployment of technology or the pace of electrification. We're realizing we're coming into situations now where we have to start figuring out how do we start phasing mature technologies out of these programs in a way that doesn't compromise the signal to continue their success, but makes sure that we have to keep going and keep finding ever lower means of reduction. So there is a lot of research and policy development and consultation work yet to be done. And I think that there is a danger among the sort of policy and the policy funding community of thinking that the fact that the LCFS is a gold standard means that we are in fact done. So we are very happy to keep working with our colleagues in Canada through the JCCTRP and through other partnerships, and look forward to continuing to answer those questions over coming years.
My only other added thought is that this issue of biomass and the emissions associated with biomass is something that has come back, and it's coming back in California right now because renewable diesel has been such a success story, and most likely will draw more soy fuel, which has a higher carbon intensity because of this land use factor. Canada doesn't have that land use factor, and in Europe they're basically limiting crop based biofuels, and that discussion has started in California. So I just think this is an ongoing discussion about sourcing biomass in a way that doesn't create unwanted consequences, but still getting sufficient quantity enough to do the job. And so, yeah.
Okay, so there's no final comments or questions. Maybe I'll just like to thank all our panelists, Julie Witcover, Colin Murphy from UC Davis, Heather MacLean from University of Toronto, Lew Fulton, who has also been involved with us from UC Davis, and Melissa Striepe, who is now at NRCan. I'm Mark Purdon at UQAM in Montreal, École des Sciences de la Gestion, and titular of the chair in decarbonization, and we're very excited to have this report out. We welcome your comments and feedback on it. We're still going to probably endeavor to polish this up and submit it to the peer review literature, but we think the report is timely, and we hope it contributes to discussions in Canada and elsewhere about these types of instruments.